Welcome to Postcards from Barnesville. I'm Pamela Morris, that witchy chick. This is the place where I will share some of the short stories I've written over the years that may otherwise spend their dark lives feeling lonely and unloved. And nobody wants that. Hello and Happy New Year! Yeah, we're big party animals here. We stayed in. We made snacks, one of them charcuterie boards or whatever they're called, and went to bed early. Always try to stay up till midnight, but never make it. And of course, the Twilight Zone marathon was on as much as my husband would allow me that night and the next day. And yeah. It was a fun New Year's Eve. Speaking of going out for a night without the kids, I've got a great story for you about Ron and Steven, who hire their usual babysitter so they can share a rare date night out together. After the guys leave, her two young charges beg to hear a ghost story at bedtime. She's a little hesitant, but they insist. And so she obliges, but the tale that she shares with the two little boys is nothing compared to what Ron and Steven will tell after they return home. Yeah, I call this one The Babysitter's Ghost Story. The hurried knock on the door came as a relief. "Kids, Mrs. Mayberry is here." Ron called up the stairs while his partner Stephen answered the door, admitting the older woman into the kitchen. "Mrs. Mayberry, yay!" The two young boys shouted with delight as they scrambled down the stairs. They loved the elderly woman. She normally watched them during the day, but had been recruited to sit for a few hours while Ron and Steve went on a long-awaited and much-needed dinner date night. The children crowded around her, hugging her at the waist as she patted them lovingly on the heads. Joanne had never been blessed with children of her own, and her babysitting jobs meant the world to her. She often remarked that she was like the old woman who lived in a shoe. With so many children, she didn't know what to do. The parents of the children she watched became her own, and their little ones were loved just as dearly as any real grandbabies could be. Ron and Stephen's boys were especially precious, as they didn't have grandparents who lived nearby. Joanne was it, and she adored every minute of it. "Oh, I'm so sorry I'm late," she apologized, looking a bit pale and disheveled. "Oh my God, what happened? Are you all right? Boys, get back. Let her get settled." She gave a dismissive wave and smiled as she took off her light jacket. "Oh, just a bit of car trouble. Stupid deer this time of year. You know how they are." Steve looked out the windows toward the driveway. "Where's your car? How'd you get here?" "Oh, it's on its way to the repair shop." She shook her head and sighed. "My nephew came and got me once the tow truck took my poor girl away. He'll pick me up too later." "Are you sure you want to be here? I mean, shouldn't you—" "Oh, pish-posh, stop it. I'm fine, just a little rattled. The car, not so much. Going to need a new hood and a left fender and a headlight and God only knows what else. It's fine." Watching the boys will actually be rather relaxing after this bit of nonsense. Ron laughed at the idea of babysitting the two monsters as being relaxing. Micah was 5, Troy 7, and they were full of every bit of it. But then they minded Mrs. Mayberry like they never did their fathers under any circumstances. "Well, if you're sure—" "Oh, sure, I'm sure. You fellas go and have a good time." Steve was already grabbing the car keys. "We'll try not to be too late, just a few hours. Take your time. We'll have fun, won't we, boys?" "Yes, ma'am," the children chimed together. Ron gave her a kiss on the cheek. "Thank you so much, Joanne. You're amazing." "My pleasure. Now scoot." With the dads finally gone, Mrs. Mayberry turned to the boys, who looked at her with eager eyes and slightly restless bodies. "Now, what do you want on your pizza?" They ate pizza with chips and dip for dinner. After bath time, they watched the Scooby-Doo movie snuggled together on the couch with a big bowl of popcorn perched between them on Mrs. Mayberry's lap. Bedtime was story time, and usually she read a book or two or three, but tonight the mischievous duo decided they wanted her to tell them a real story, a ghost story. Just like they have on Scooby-Doo, but real. Please. Mrs. Mayberry frowned at the idea. The last thing she wanted was to scare the boys, and she didn't think their parents much like her doing that either, but they pestered and whined and assured her that they wouldn't be scared at all. All right, she conceded, but if you can't sleep tonight, don't blame it on me. We won't, they giggled. This is a story my grandpa used to tell me and my brother and sister and cousins, she began, and he swore it was God's honest truth. Grandpa was a strong, tall man. He ran a repair shop for a living, fixing cars and trucks and big old farm tractors. He told us about the time a car came to the shop all covered with dirt and bird droppings and weeds. It had been sitting out behind this fellow's parents' house for years. They'd finally decided it was time to haul it out of there and get it running again. Apparently the car had belonged to the man's brother who died years back in a car wreck. Not the same car, mind you, but with a couple of other friends in one of their cars. 2 of the 3 died that night, and his brother's car just sat there, only to be started once more when they moved it out of the way. The tires were all flat, the oil was gummed up, the gas had gone bad, and the battery was deader than a doornail. But the body was good, and that's what mattered. My grandpa was sure he could get it running again in no time. What kind of car was it? Troy wanted to know. Mrs. Mayberry shrugged. Oh, I don't remember that. But it's important. Make something up, Micah encouraged. If I make something up, it won't be true, and you said you wanted a real ghost story. Yeah, but now, do you want me to lie and make something up, or do you want the truth? Troy sighed. The truth. All right, then. I know it was a white Buick, but I don't know the year or anything else about that. That do you? Yeah, I suppose, Micah echoed his older brother. Anyway, she went on, Grandpa had some cars ahead of it to work on, so that Buick sat for a couple days before he pulled it into one of the 2 bays he had and set to work getting all the old bad fluids out of it. He let it sit overnight just to be extra certain it all drained out. That same night, he woke up to the sound of someone moving around in his garage. He looked out the bedroom window, and all the lights were on, and he was sure he heard the radio playing out there. He always had music going while he worked. Quick as he could, he pulled some clothes on and went out to see what was going on. But by the time he got downstairs and out the back door, the garage was dark and silent. You have been listening to The Babysitter's Ghost Story by Pamela Morris. If you're enjoying this tale and would like more, visit my website, PamelaMorrisBooks.com, for a full selection of my available novels and collections. Link is in the description below. And now, let's get back to the conclusion of The Babysitter's Ghost Story. He thought maybe an intruder had heard him coming and was in there hiding. Grandpa found the door locked, just like he'd done before heading in for the night. The 2 overhead doors were locked up tight too, and there wasn't any other way to get in but those. So he dug out his keys and let himself in and flipped on the bright overhead fluorescent lights and shouted, "Who's in there?" Nobody answered, of course. That made Grandpa mad. He looked all over but didn't find anyone. They must have run out real fast. That's all he could figure. Nothing looked to be missing, and nothing was out of place. So he locked it all back up tight and went back to bed. Same thing happened the next night, and the next. But then he was fit to be tied and told my grandmother he was going to spend the night out there and catch whoever it was. There was a little room in the back where he kept parts, and that's where he decided to plant a lawn chair and wait it out. He locked the doors and turned off the lights, as always, then snuck to the back room. After more than a few hours, he found himself jarred awake by the sound of the radio playing and the bright light flooding in from the other room. He sat real still at first, listening, then eased up on the lawn chair and tiptoed his way to the doorway and peeked out. He could see both sides of the nearest car, and there wasn't anybody near it, but the old car was partially blocked, and whoever was out there seemed to be doing something on the other side near the back tires. Grandpa didn't say a word. He wanted to surprise the person. He said he could hear them singing along with the radio in bits and pieces, heard metal tools being set down on concrete, things like that. With nothing but a big wrench in his hand, Grandpa inched his way along, then lurched out, expecting to catch the intruder red-handed. But the second he did that, the lights went out and the radio snapped off. Grandpa said he hollered to blue blazes, thinking he was about to be attacked from behind. He swung around, ready to clobber the intruder with the wrench, but no one attacked. Nothing at all happened. He hadn't seen anyone either. He stomped his way to the wall switch and turned the lights back on, cussing up a storm. I imagine. Nobody was there. Nothing was out of place. The old car was exactly the way he'd left it. Wow. Troy's eyes were wide and round. It was a ghost, wasn't it? Micah just stared. Mrs. Mayberry shrugged. Huh? Could have been. After that night, Grandpa got that Buick fixed up as quick as he could. When he watched the happy owner drive it away down the street a few days later, he said he never felt so relieved in his life. Nothing like that ever happened again at the garage. But here Mrs. Mayberry paused, looking from one boy to the other. Even though my grandpa's garage burned down long ago, last I knew that very same car was still around here. I'm pretty sure I've seen it. It's still around? Troy whispered with awe. Is it still haunted? Still around, as far as I know. Still haunted. She grinned. Now, I think it's time you two boys got to sleep. Micah looked like he was about to burst into tears. Mrs. Mayberry rose, kissed each of them on the forehead, and headed for the door. I'll leave the bedroom door open and the hall light on, okay? Okay. Their voices were timid and grateful. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Ron and Stephen returned home. The television was on, there was an empty pizza box on the table, and all the lights in the place were on. They found Troy and Micah cuddled together and both sound asleep in Troy's bed. Mrs. Mayberry, however, was nowhere to be found. This isn't like her, Ron said. Maybe her nephew showed up early. But not even a note? That's not like her at all. It didn't make any sense. She would never have left the Bosie alone for any reason. I'm going to call. Her home phone rang 3 times, and only to be picked up by the answering machine. Ron left a message, felt even more uneasy. He tried her cell phone, which went to voicemail. I don't like this, he said. Let's just go to bed. The boys are both fine. I'm sure there's a perfectly rational explanation. We'll try calling again in the morning. It's late. But there would be no need for a phone call the next day. The answer came in the most unexpected of ways while Stephen whisked eggs for Saturday morning breakfast. The images of Mrs. Mayberry's car nose first into a tree, the windshield smashed through, a dead deer along the roadside, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, and a draped gurney as it was lifted and slid into an awaiting ambulance made his blood run cold. Just before 7:30 last night, the reporter intoned, emergency vehicles responded to a one-car accident along Route 35 in the town of Maddock. The driver, 73-year-old Joanne Mayberry, was pronounced dead at the scene. 7:30, just 15 minutes before the babysitter had come knocking on their door. You have just listened to Postcards from Barnesville with Pamela Morris, that Witchy Chick. A place for free short stories that otherwise may have spent their dark lives lonely and unloved. Please subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoyed this reading and to keep the stories coming. Be sure to check your mailbox for another postcard from Barnesville, from that Witchy Chick soon. And thank you for listening.